On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to discuss the coming Jewish New Year. On the evening of September 12th, Israel will begin the 7th year in their sabbatical cycles. This is called the Sabbatical year. Now, there's something very important about the sabbatical year. There are prophecies attached to it in Leviticus chapters 25 and 26 and Daniel chapter 9. You remember those. Gary's 10 minutes here to discuss with me Rosh Hashanah 5768.
And we are coming to the end of one sabbatical cycle, starting with this Rosh Hashanah, and at the next Rosh Hashanah, we'll start a new sabbatical cycle. Why all this interest in sabbatical cycles? Let's go back to Leviticus 25, verses 3 and 4. 6 years shalt thou sow thy field, 6 years shalt thou prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow thy field nor prune thy vineyard. This was the law. It's often been used as an illustration for good husbandry. That is, this is a good way to farm, to preserve your land so that it'll produce more crops and so forth. And indeed that's true, but it's much, much more. A Shavuah, that is this 7-year cycle, is God's way of looking at time.
And Jeremiah was the Old Testament expert on Leviticus 25 and 26, the Mosaic law of the sabbatical cycles. For example, in 2 Chronicles 36:21, Jeremiah said that the Jewish people were enslaved by Babylon in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So the 70 years in Babylonian captivity was to give the land its Sabbaths, because you see, for 490 years, every 7th year, total of 70 sabbatical years, Israel did not keep this sabbatical law, the law of the sabbatical year. Now, this was spread out over a period of about 1,000 years, Gary, but during that time, Israel was neglecting the law of the sabbatical year until finally they had failed to keep the 70th sabbatical year, and God said, 70 times 7, I've forgiven you enough. That's it. He sent them into Babylonian captivity so that the land would lie desolate for 70 years and thus keep its Sabbaths. That's the prophecy involved here. And Gary, a lot more is involved as well in the realm of prophecy.
Absolutely. Now, we mentioned that this 7-year cycle is called a Shavuah. It's called in English a sabbatical cycle. But the Bible often refers to this 7-year period simply as a week. It would be a prophetic week. This brings us to, I think, the most significant time prophecy in the entire Bible, and that would be the 70 weeks of Daniel. Those are not just weeks as we think of weeks. They're very special weeks.
They are Shavuos.
Yes.
They are sabbatical cycles.
Right.
So Daniel here, when Darius the Mede took over and became king over the Babylonian Empire, overthrew Belshazzar, set up the Medes and the Persians Empire. The arms and chests of silver replaced the head of gold. Then Daniel was studying Jeremiah, and this is what he found in Daniel chapter 9, verse 2. In the first year of his, that is Darius' reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of years whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. So here we have Daniel studying Jeremiah, and he learns that these 70 years were sabbatical years.
I think there's a great illustration here, too. He discovered by books. Notice that, use that expression. In other words,
Yes.
he studied. Study the Word.
Yes.
It begins there. But then the Lord added a revelation to what Daniel had already acquired by studying books.
He somehow or another, he got a copy of Jeremiah's prophecy. He must have, sent a mail order check to Jerusalem and bought one from some bookstore there, because Jeremiah had only a few years before the Babylonian captivity wrote these things down. Actually, Jeremiah was around when the Babylonians took over. He headed down to Egypt. And so, yes, by the way, Zedekiah, who was the puppet king of Nebuchadnezzar to govern over Judah during this Babylonian captivity, Zedekiah threw Jeremiah in a miry pit. So Jeremiah is there in the first years of this Babylonian captivity, and Jeremiah somehow had written down in his prophecy, which we have in the Bible here, the book of Jeremiah, that Israel would be in captivity for 70 years because they refused to keep the law of the sabbatical cycles in Leviticus 25 and 26. This is most important. Daniel got a hold of that book, and I guess also he was studying Leviticus. So there are the two books from which, and he might have even seen the Chronicles that said this was fulfilling the prophecy by the mouth of Jeremiah that they would be 70 years. So Daniel's calculating, well, hey, it's been 69 years. Next year it'll be 70. We'll be going home soon. I think that's one of the main things he saw here. But then, of course, he began to pray, and Gabriel comes. This is the sabbatical cycles, the 70 sabbatical cycles, the 70 weeks that Gabriel gave to Daniel. And this takes us far into the future, doesn't it? This is not just the 70 sabbatical years that they were in Babylon, but this is a further prophecy. I guess Gabriel says to Daniel, Daniel, I'm glad you figured it out. Now get ready for another prophecy, and this one is most important.
Now, the one given to Daniel by Gabriel is the centerpiece of all-timed prophecy. And it begins in Daniel 9:24, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make a reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision of the prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. You could spend an hour on that verse.
Isn't that
terrific? That's a wonderful verse. But 70 weeks are determined upon thy people. Now that would be the 12 tribes. And upon thy holy city, that would be Jerusalem. And so, having said that, let's go ahead and talk about the 70 weeks of Daniel.
Yeah. Oh, what a fantastic study. Here he's got a list of a number of things here that these 70 weeks are going to fulfill.
Now, back to Daniel's 70 weeks. Let's suppose hypothetically an angel comes to you and gives you a timed prophecy. I think your very first question is going to be, well, that's wonderful. When does it start? I want to know when the 70 weeks start. Yeah. And we have in Daniel 9:25, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks. And let's just stop right there. That's first 7 weeks then would be a Shavuah.
Yes. Now first Gabriel starts out with the 70 weeks. Then he begins to break it down. He doesn't talk about the first 69 weeks. He talks about the first 7 weeks. And then the 62 weeks. Why does he divide these into 7 and 62? That's very important for us to understand as we look at this. Now, Gary, he says it'll begin with a decree to restore and build Jerusalem. Well, most modern theologians and ministers like to look at Nehemiah chapter 1 to 445 BC and the decree by Artaxerxes. I don't know why they overlook the obvious, but the obvious decree was made by Cyrus 1 year after Daniel received this prophecy. So here we are in the 69th week, at the end of the 69 years, and next year a decree is going to be issued by Cyrus By the way, Cyrus takes over the kingdom of the Medes and Persians because he's the son-in-law of Darius, and Darius is giving him the kingdom as a wedding present for marrying his daughter. And Isaiah talked about Cyrus as God's shepherd. Isaiah 44:28 says, that saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built into the temple, thy foundation shall be laid. This is the decree that goes forth to restore and build Jerusalem that Gabriel is talking about here.
Isaiah wrote these words, by the way, before Cyrus was a person.
175 years before Cyrus. Yes.
Indeed. A lot of liberal scholars will tell you these are later additions. A scribe dropped that in later because he knew what had already happened. Don't you believe it? This is a prophecy given in advance for good reason, and I think JR has locked it up here. This is a great place to start that first Shavuot.
Yes. So Cyrus issued the commandment soon after he ascended the throne, late in 537 BC. That would be somewhere between September and December. Then Zerubbabel led the initial return with 49,697 people in the spring of 536 BC. On the following September 24th, 536 BC, the Jews from all over the surrounding area came to Jerusalem. They rebuilt the altar. They started sacrifices. They observed the Feast of Trumpets on September 24th. And then the following May, that's about 9 months later, construction was started on the foundation for the temple. Then the following September 14th, 535 BC, the people observed the beginning of a sabbatical year, which continued until October 2nd, 534 BC, at which time the first year of Gabriel's first set of 7-year cycles commenced. So here we have the 70 years, or the 70 sabbatical cycles that Gabriel's talking about, begins on October 2nd, 534 BC. Now that is set in stone, Gary. It's a very calculable thing to find. But see, Gabriel's 70 weeks are sabbatical cycles. So the sabbatical cycle doesn't start in 537 or 538 or 536 because that is not year one of a 7-year cycle. The cycle began, the 7-year cycle began in 534. And on October 2nd, 534 BC, and we have the first 7 cycles. Gary, that's 49 years. So 49 years later, there had to be some kind of historical significant event that would stop the counting of these 70 weeks. It stopped. There was an interregnum period, a gap between the 7th week and the 8th week. A period, and by the way, let me tell you what happened at the end of 49 years. Ahasuerus, husband of Esther, died. And Gary, that stopped everything. That stopped God's clock right there. Esther was no longer on the throne. It began a time called troublous times. Remember, Nehemiah came in 445 BC, and then he and Ezra began to have all these problems with the Samaritans, with Sanballat and Tobiah. Yes. These were troublous times. And for 77 years, that's 11 sabbatical cycles, we have this gap. And it comes to a conclusion, Gary, when Malachi publishes his prophecy in 408 BC. And the prophecy says, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and terrible day of the Lord come. Gary, the counting begins with the publishing of Malachi. And for 62 Shavuos, we come down to 434 years later. In AD 27. And that concludes the 69th week, so to speak. And you know, shortly after that, Jesus is baptized and begins his ministry.
Now let me repeat this so that it'll be clear to you. We've thrown a lot of numbers at you. Daniel 9:25, know therefore and understand that from the going forth the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, / little time pause, and 62 weeks. That's 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. That's what J.R. mentioned. So we had a 70 times 7 period
Yes.
that ended
Yes.
with death of Ahasuerus. And then it commenced again in the days of Malachi. And so we're talking about a gap of 485 BC to 408 BC. Now, J.R., let's take us beyond that.
Listen to verse 26. Gabriel, talking to Daniel, says, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off. Notice, please, he doesn't say, and after 69 weeks. He doesn't say that. He says after 62 weeks. So Gabriel has inserted a gap between the 7th week and the 8th week in the 69 sabbatical cycles.
Yes.
And we can see that. And by the way, they were 11 sabbatical cycles long. This interregnum, this gap period, was 77 years long. And it has a date when to begin it. That's after 49 years. And it has a date to begin again when Malachi gives his prophecy. And it comes down then to the ministry of Jesus, and he is crucified and dies for the sins. It says here, he'll be cut off, but not for himself. That is, he died for others. He died to pay the sin debt for the whole world. He didn't die for himself. If it was himself, he could have come off that cross. He could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and to keep him from being crucified. But he didn't do that. He did it for us. And then it says, the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Gary, that happened 40 years later in AD 70 when Titus destroyed the temple, Herod's temple, and destroyed the city of Jerusalem and carried the people off in bondage. So this is what he's talking about here. The people of the prince that shall come. The prince, by the way, is the Antichrist. And the people of the prince are the Romans, which means the Antichrist will be of Roman royalty. That's pretty plain here.
It's very, very plain. And not to cloud the issue with too many details, after that period, another gap started. Gabriel gave a prophecy in which 3 periods of time were mentioned. There was 7, there was 62, and then there was another 1. But between the 62 and the 1, there's this long gap. Why such a long gap?
That's a good question, Gary. You know, God said in Leviticus 26:18, if after I send you into captivity and I bring you back, if you still do not repent and start keeping the sabbatical years, I will multiply your judgment 7 times more. Gary, 70 weeks multiplied times 7 is 490 sabbatical cycles. That's 3,430 years. That's a long time. Now, if we go back to the first sabbatical cycle, when Joshua instituted the law of the sabbatical year, we have, at this point, just over 3,430 of these sabbatical years, or number of years. These sabbatical cycles total over a little. In fact, in 1993-94, we arrived at the 3,430th year of these cycles. So, you know, Gary, you remember signing on the White House lawn the peace accord, and our president, you know, put his arms around the 2 warring factions and said, come on, boys, shake hands. This is a new day. Well, that fit perfectly with the end of the 3,430th year.
Now, that was a sabbatical year and that was in 1993, 1994. If you examine the year 1993-4, JR, this was a very significant year, coming just after the Gulf War, after when George H.W. Bush bailed out Kuwait, whose oil fields had been set aflame. We had the Desert Storm, Operation Desert Storm in 1991, which in itself was kind of a signal event for the United States. That's the Psalm 91 year. That's when the troops began to read Psalm 91 and talk about the Lord's protection. But then right after that, you had the uprising, the Arab Intifada, and you had the event spoken of by JR in which Yasser Arafat and Israel's prime minister were forced, and I mean forced, to shake hands. Yeah. And after that, JR, we seemed to enter a new era, the era of the Intifada. So that's, shall we say, the end of that 490th sabbatical cycle.
Now, this, Leviticus 26:18. But notice, please, from AD 27 until this year will conclude the 283rd sabbatical year since AD 27. Now, I have no idea what that number means. I do know that from the days of Joshua, if all the calculations are correct, I have no reason to doubt them being, 1993-94 was a sabbatical year that concluded with the 70th Jubilee. Mm-hmm. And by the way, that was the 490th sabbatical year since Joshua started the whole thing. 490. And then 1994-95 was supposed to be a Jubilee. It would have been the 70th Jubilee. Well, if you recall, when Jesus died on Calvary, the next sabbatical, at the end of that sabbatical cycle, was the 30th Jubilee. And now we've come past the 70th Jubilee. So there have been 40 Jubilees since Calvary. Now, I don't know what all that means, but listen to what Gabriel said. He said, "And the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end of the war, desolations are determined." So 1993, if you look at Psalm 93, you'll find out that it's only 5 verses long, and it's filled with all these floods. Mm-hmm. And the year 1993 had floods all over the world. There wasn't a single nation that was exempt from these floods. I mean, all of Nepal, northern India, is flooded. The whole nation of China and India. China called it the Black Rain, and
Europe was flooded.
In fact, there were a couple of Bedouins drowned in the Negev desert. Gary, that's what's so amazing to me.
Now, we are rapidly running out of time. We have come to the end of an explanation of the Shavua, or the sabbatical cycle. This brings us to a fascinating series of speculations, because we Gentiles, in operating in the Spirit, and looking for the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, have one way of thinking about all this. Yeah. The Jews, on the other hand, who are very busily seeking the date of the coming of the Messiah, have an entirely different way of looking at things.
Now, Gary, there were some theologians, Christian theologians, who implied that the tribulation period would be the last 7 years of the 6th millennium, from 1994 to the year 2000. Well, that sounded good. The only problem is it didn't happen.
It didn't happen.
And then there was one Christian theologian who said it'll be the first, and he wrote it in a book, he published it in a book, be the first 7 years of this millennium. Well, it didn't happen either, Gary. We are now in the sabbatical year. I don't see Armageddon. I don't see the second coming. I haven't heard any trumpet sound. So, and all of the judgments. But, yes, in the Zohar, a 700-year-old Jewish commentary, they say that the tribulation period will begin at the end of this sabbatical cycle. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not setting a date here. I'm just reporting what date they have said. And on our next program, we're going to get involved in this incredible prophecy from the 13th century.
JR, our audience needs to read your article in the latest prophecy in the news.
I hope you'll get it. Order it today. Call the phone number at the bottom of your screen. This is J.R. Church and Gary Stearman. Until next time, keep looking up.